Thank you, Richard. I'd like to begin by thanking UW Center for 21st Century Studies for its generous and unmitigated support for our still ongoing transdisciplinary research project. I think it's still ongoing. It's not as yet ended, not because we want more money, which we do, but that there's always food for thought and there's an afterlife to every project. I would especially wish to mention both Richard Gruson and Mary Mullen for their enormous and unflinching confidence in our somewhat unconventional collaboration and what it would yield. Besides our own chemistry, that is the chemistry of Tim, Brian, and myself, little of what we present today would have been possible without your specific interventions. I also took the opportunity to talk a little bit about contested ecologies, which is actually there on the poster. So to turn to contested ecologies, and within your hopefully recent views and memories of the poster designed to advertise this very event, the dramatic view of beached ships in the seemingly inconsequential town of Moynok in western Uzbekistan, I begin by asking the broader questions relevant to our discussion. How do past landscapes preserve the palimpsest of public memory? Dolores Hayden, the architectural historian, asked this very question when interrogating urban landscape, but I believe that this would be just as relevant for a landscape site removed or in close proximity to cities or places, natural settings or conditions, and in particular, where a variety of resources have been and continue to be found, shared, squandered, or jealously guarded. Moynok, this inconsequential town, known but to a few, was once a bustling fishing town situated at the very end of Central Asia's important Amu Darya River, at the very lips of the Aral Sea, as it fell into a large delta. And apparently the word Moynok in Kipchak actually means the hair on the lips. So it actually shows you the proximity of this particular town to the water. Today, its empty streets and steadily declining population are among the few clues to an environmental catastrophe that has made the water edge of Aral to recede some 150 miles from Moynok's earlier shoreline, transforming it from a town with a beach to one with beached ships in dry, salty sand. In an era of intensified climate change and global conflict, these described landscape ecologies such as the Amu Darya floodplain and the Aral Sea are increasingly contested, both in the geopolitical and in the academic spheres. The Aral and the Amu, as I prefer to call them, permanences in cultural memories of the Central Asian people, were considered collateral for the way forward. After all, cotton had to be grown in the desert. Even more interestingly, the depleted Amu Darya and the dry Aral remain just as useful to human greed. While within this purview of contested ecologies, our research is therefore especially interested in ecological borderlands as regions still reconciling to their past and recent histories, in spatial slivers that straddle the intertwined constraints of geographies and resources. These borderlands or borderland ecologies embody conditions for the emergence and the escalation of conflict. In our attention towards contested ecologies, we seek to have conversations on ecology and coloniality, and on the ways in which modern thinking, with its bifurcation of nature and culture, constitutes ecology within a very particular politics of the cosmos. We would also like to focus on the landscape ecologies of borderlands and resources, not just as backdrops to human action, but as avenues to understanding their engagements with their material worlds, depending upon particularities of time and place. Finally, we're interested in the sense of place and its opposite, placelessness, two dichotomies created by these ecological or resource borderlands through time. How have and how do still mobile, migrating, and migrant people make sense of the unfamiliar and reconcile their many differences? How do they work and rework the memories of place left behind within broader schemes to share their borderlands with others or resist these temptations? My own research presentation later today shall be a brief snapshot of Central Asia's mother of geographical truisms, the ancient Oxus or the later Amu Darya River. So I conclude here my little piece on contested ecologies, and I move very quickly to introducing our first speaker, Professor Scott McMillin, T. Scott McMillin, who's Professor of English and Environmental Studies at Oberlin College in Ohio. T. Scott McMillin, or TS as he prefers to be called, is the author of 2 books, The Meaning of Rivers, Flow and Reflection in American Literature, published in 2011, and Our Preposterous Use of Literature, Emerson and the Nature of Reading, published in 2000. In addition, he has written numerous articles on the American Transcendentalists, including Beauty Meets Beast, Emerson's English Traits, an essay in the collection Emerson for the 21st Century, Global Perspectives on an American Icon, published in 2010. T.S.'s provocative writings capture his nuanced interpretations of nature, the natural, the man-made, and beyond. Via and beyond his readings of Emerson, T.S. moves to capture the biography of the Los Angeles River in his most recent and ongoing project, which combines archival research, fieldwork, mapping, and an engrossed examination of diverse sources that talk about what is the LA River and what it no longer is. This and similar discussions are extremely relevant today in the continental United States and in other parts of the world, where rivers have served to connect, divide, and mediate between places and people as they maneuver their way through rural and now increasingly urban landscapes. In The Meanings of Rivers, now in paperback, T.S. explores the diverse vantages that rise from a body of literature that explores American nature, ranging from travel accounts of 17th century Puritan colonists to magazine articles by 21st century enthusiasts of extreme sports, embracing a hybrid essayistic form, part literary theory, part cultural history, and part fieldwork. His writings in The Meanings of Rivers connects the humanities to other disciplines and scholarly work to the land. Whether developing a theory of palindromes or reading works of American literature as varied as Henry David Thoreau's A Week on the Concord and the Merrimack Rivers and James Dickey's Deliverance, McMillin urges readers towards a transcendental retracing of their own interpretive encounters. Similarly, in Our Preposterous Use of Literature, Emerson and the Nature of Reading, T.S. conducts a bold inquiry into the political and philosophical nature of reading. He examines the ways in which Emerson's texts have been read in the United States, the myriad methods by which these texts have been pillaged, picked over, and repackaged, in a word, consumed by biographers, political apologists, self-help proponents, entrepreneurs, and academicians alike. He proposes a new natural philosophy of reading, a method of reading at once more responsible to the texts we interpret and more closely connected to the worlds in which our own interpretations take place. Yesterday we were talking to him about the archive, and that is precisely how he looks at an archive as well. T.S. is also a dear friend, and I have much to admire and respect in his mature and passionate works. We met for the first time about a year ago at the Riverscaping Conference in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I have since then so much looked forward to sharing his wonderful insights and superbly articulate writings with all of you. Please join me in welcoming T. Scott McMillin as our first invited speaker in C21's Transdisciplinary Challenge Awards Symposium.
Do I have to click on something to get out of this one? Yeah, I seem to do something. I'll just make your own. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to my friend Manu Soti for honoring me with an invitation to be a part of Contested Ecologies. Thanks also to Mary for getting me out here and putting me up, and thanks to Richard for making all this possible. I want to begin with a confession. I have long had a discipline problem, going back at least to my undergraduate experience. I still remember getting back my first essay from the graduate teaching assistant for Introduction to Philosophy with his contemptuous comment, "This is too literary." That contempt was equaled by the TA in my English class who scrawled across my first essay, This is too philosophical. The rest, as they say, is history. Perhaps because of that auspicious beginning, but certainly related to it, I have been drawn to topics and thinkers that trouble disciplinary waters. Most of the courses that I teach count toward two majors, English and Environmental Studies, one of which is obviously interdisciplinary, and the other a discipline of multiple methodological threads entangled about a malleable object of study. And in my research for the last decade, I have been exploring the meaning of rivers, phenomena that by their nature raise a host of diverse questions and invite a variety of approaches. At least to myself, under my breath, as it were, I have called this area of study textual potamology, which involves using text to think about rivers, using rivers to think about texts, and using this dual directional thinking to inquire into the nature of meaning. Thanks to Professor Sopti's most gracious invitation to speak today from, quote, whatever you take to be your disciplinary perspective, end quote. I have been reflecting of late on just what that perspective might be. Textual potamology, beyond the little joke I share with myself, has not until now formally existed, and I assure you that you will find no mention of it in any official catalog of academic disciplines. There are, however, examples of what I think of as textual potamology in a book of essays that poke around, as she says, in a number of rivers and reflect on the connections between ideas and life. The philosopher Kathleen Dean Moore discusses two kinds of clarity. One, the modern kind, is the kind of clarity scholars and researchers seek through disciplinary specificity, the sharp-edged, single-bladed truth, transparent, well-defined, free of obscurity, confusion, or doubt. This modern clarity strives for precision, operates from a foundational determinism, and adheres to a binary logic that, as theoretical physicist and transdisciplinarian Basarab Nicolescu puts it, has ruled our thinking for 2 millennia and continues to dominate it today, particularly in political, social, and economic spheres. The other kind of clarity, which Moore calls ancient, in part because its meaning stems from Latin roots related to bells, connotes a ringing quality, lustrous, splendid, radiating. In her essays, Moore uses various rivers as occasions for trying to see clearly in both senses of the word, an intellectual effort to transcend the inherent ambiguity of clarity and seek greater meanings of the stream. In some of her essays, Moore appeals to the authority of Henry David Thoreau, and I see in his writing another exemplar of textual potamology. His first book, A Complex Weave that relates his experiments on the waters of the Concord and Merrimack rivers, considers different aspects of nature, including that which is commonly hidden to us, occluded in part because of the primary disciplines that shape our perception of the world. He writes that, after sitting in my chamber many days, reading the poets, I have been out early on a foggy morning and heard the cry of an owl in a neighboring wood, as from a nature behind the common, unexplored by science or by literature. For me, this event suggests a model of textual potamology, rigorously studying literature inside, that is, within the structure designed and built by and for humans, deeply inside culture, as it were, and consumed with a specific disciplinary task, understanding the works of previous writers. The scholar then goes outside, into the field, into the present, surrounded by the foggy atmosphere which reduces visual clarity and renders his coordinates indistinct. Whereas before his place and his attention were determined and directed, he now finds himself comparatively directionless and his bearings indeterminate. Suddenly rings out the cry of an owl, like a bell, calling him to his senses, which, so enlivened, reveal the possibility of something like a nature from which he has been estranged. This calling enables him to question the limits of literary and scientific explorations of nature, world, truth, the real, cosmos, and imagine another aspect of nature, of which we are commonly ignorant. A nature behind the common, unexplored by science or by literature. Thoreau, who in a later writing reminds us that the universe is wider than our views of it, here suggests that both of those approaches to knowing, scientific and literary, fail to fully explore nature due to their disciplinary specificity, the kinds of questions they ask, and the ways in which they go about communicating their findings. The or, in Thoreau's phrase, is significant. If it were and, we would have the makings of a critique of interdisciplinarity. That one approach is empirical and the other not also probably matters. Disciplines vastly different in their objects of study, their methods, and their goals cannot, by virtue of the circumscription of their singular scopes, reveal the nature that dwells beneath our familiar modes of construing the world, our customary worldviews. And the going outside, beyond the comfortable, familiar structure of his chamber, into the foggy now, opens up the possibility for noticing the call of the owl. Had he remained inside, his mind bent on his disciplined study, there would be too many layers, physical and cognitive, too much distance between inside and outside for the owl's call to come to his attention. So Thoreau goes outside, though he will eventually come back in to write his book. He never, in any of his expeditions, just goes out and stays out. His experiment in textual potamology involves movement back and forth and trying to report his findings from that movement, transcending disciplinary specificity, at least momentarily, opening oneself to something wider, grander, but then connecting the experience of that greater world to disciplinary efforts, in this case, producing a literary text. The text he produced in this case, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, is considered by many to be Thoreau's most transcendental book, and this suggests a relationship to the writings of his friend, mentor, sponsor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. As the leading light of American transcendentalism, Emerson wrote sermons, lectures, essays, and poems on history, politics, philosophy, culture, nature, and religion. While it is difficult and missing the point to sum up these writings, I will venture to say that throughout his career, Emerson sought to encourage critical reflection and imagination in his readers and listeners, believing that his contemporaries were prone to take up and cling to particular ideas, a culturally conditioned intellectual conservatism from which it was nearly impossible to escape, a sleep from which he enjoined us to awake. As he himself put it relatively late in his career, the source of mischief is the extreme difficulty with which men are roused from the torpor of every day. Blessed is all that agitates the mass, breaks up this torpor, and begins motion. Emerson proposed that in the current state of affairs, people had turned their backs on newness and change, on hope, and had given in to the inertia that comes from holding on to accustomed perspectives and institutionalized practices. Being willing and able to reconsider the state of affairs is necessary for us to drag ourselves from stagnation and move onward towards some yet unimagined understanding of the way things are. He pursued this issue from an unlikely analogy. Corpora non agunt nisi soluta. The chemical rule is true in mind. Contrast, change, interruption are necessary to new activity and new combinations. Citing a chemical or alchemical principle dating back to Aristotle, Emerson's use of the phrase promotes a fluidity of mind over a solid or static state for the sake of new ways of thinking and new modes of conducting what we take to be our business. With the potential for such newness comes hope, while Emerson's passing use of chemistry in a literary essay aimed at having political effects at an important moment of American history is intriguing. I am even more intrigued by the relation between Emersonian transcendentalism with its speculations on movement, newness, different ways of seeing, and interconnectedness, and some of the philosophical principles underlying transdisciplinarity. For example, that there are different levels of reality, that there are correspondingly different levels of perception, that philosophical abstraction is not simply an intermediary between us and nature, a tool for describing reality, but rather one of the constituent parts of nature. Emerson's interest in the importance of fluid boundaries, for instance, resonates with what I understand to be one of the most provocative terms in his writing, abandonment. And I am drawn to this term as a possible explanation for the genesis of textual potamology, for what I take to be my disciplinary perspective, as well as a potential relative of transdisciplinarity. The word, which appears incidentally in a number of his published writings throughout his career and at key moments in some of his most prominent essays, was itself subject to substantial fluidity in its definition and usage. In an essay on Plato or the philosopher, abandonment is associated with daring imagination, whereas in English traits it is depicted negatively as a lack of control. More often than not, however, abandonment has positive connotations, whether in describing the power of the works of Hafiz in the essay on Persian poetry, or more generally to discuss the lack of linearity in the way in which life unfolds. In the essay Works and Days, after observing that everything in the universe goes by indirection, and thus there are no straight lines, Emerson endorses a statement of a foreign scholar: "There can be no greatness without abandonment." Readers are enjoined to fill the hour, not just let it lapse or expire. Abandonment is a joyful giving oneself up to the forces of the earth, surfing on the changing waves of time, the exhilarating enjoyment of place, actively and interconnectedly living. In the essay Immortality, abandonment belongs to a religious sentiment. It is a giving oneself up to the highest. Similarly, and yet not quite, in an essay called The Preacher, abandonment functions in two different ways. First, to describe a culture's lamentable turning away from religious sentiment. Second, as the sentiment itself. People have abandoned religious, scientific, political, and economic institutions for other better or worse forms, Emerson wrote. Traditions are losing their hold on human belief, and everything is marked by restlessness and dissatisfaction. The old forms rattle, and the new delay to appear. Material and industrial activity have materialized the age, and the mind, haughty with its sciences, disdains the religious forms as childish. As a result, we have lost the, quote, religious submission and abandonment, which give man a new element and being and make him sublime, end quote. We have, that is, abandoned abandonment and conformed our mental operations and the world those operations construct to the terms of material, industrial, scientific discourses. Emerson's concern arose at a radically different historical moment and pursued an angle divergent from contemporary transdisciplinarity. But I see a connection between his concern in The Preacher and that recently expressed by a theoretical physicist. Nicolescu, in Manifesto of Transdisciplinarity, proposes that we are on the verge of triple self-destruction: material, biological, and spiritual, and that this perilous state is the result of, quote, a blind but triumphant technoscience obedient only to the implacable logic of utilitarianism, end quote. In phrasing that mirrors Emerson's, Nicolescu laments that the word spirituality has become suspect and its use has been practically abandoned. He urges readers to learn from the lessons of quantum physics, rethink the relations between subjects and objects, and transcend our current ways of knowing. Transdisciplinarity, Nicolescu writes, is a generalized transgression which opens an unlimited space for freedom, understanding, tolerance, and love. This transgressive approach resembles that of transcendentalism, which perhaps can be clarified through further consideration of abandonment. In The Method of Nature, Emerson associated abandonment with love. The essay, based on a lecture delivered in August 1841 to a literary society at what eventually became Colby College, proposed abandonment as an attitude, a position one might take, albeit a position disposed towards shifting and flexibility. Emerson connects this attitude, a disposition toward dispossession, a sort of beside oneselfness, with love, which he defined as an overpowering enthusiasm, never self-possessed, all abandonment. This idea comes forth near the end of an oration intended for young literary scholars, part of an overall point that in order to think well about the things in which we are interested, we need to actively relate those things and that thinking to nature and nature's method. Removed from nature, the discipline dries up. Quoting Emerson, Nothing solid is secure. Everything tilts and rocks. Even the scholar is not safe. He too is searched and revised. Is his learning dead? Is he living in memory? The power of mind is not mortification, but life. Emerson recommends exploring the method of nature, which he italicizes, and transferring what is learned to our disciplinary efforts, trying to be mindful of what most scientists must concede, that a mysterious principle of life must be assumed, which not only inhabits the organ, but makes the organ. Abandonment, a word used in the essay to describe the effect of love, characterizes a stance or attitude of enthusiasm, quote, in which the individual is no longer his own foolish master, end quote. Having abandoned the customary self and his perspective on the world, the abandoner opens herself or himself to new ways of seeing the world and consults every omen in nature with tremulous interest. To adopt such a stance, one must first overcome fancied freedom and self-rule, as he put it, for these amount to so much depth. That is, one's imagined independence of thought and understanding, coupled with the perceived control of one's destiny through self-imposed discipline, are but forms of cutting oneself off from life. To overturn such a condition of so much death requires an active will that sets the perceiving self in motion, from which one can begin to become, as he said, wiser. The abandoner sees new every time he looks. Taken in the context of counsel given to scholars, abandonment supposes taking off the lab coat, the mortarboard, the familiar and customary, a shucking and shedding of established credentials and attendant viewpoints for the love of truth. Abandoning one's scholarly position involves turning one's back on oneself, looking forward to what else might be seen. A scholarly attitude of abandonment gives one a chance to look at one's looking, to follow the line of the disciplinary gaze and see how it positions the object under scrutiny. Abandonment allows for self-reflection by putting the self in motion. You are not walking out on your family, colleagues, profession, society, as much as you are abandoning peculiar, received, and static notions of yourself and reconnecting your methods, what you do and think, with the method of nature. Thence, some really difficult but really fresh ways of thinking might arise. Whereas in the method of nature, abandonment is an attitude, two essays from an 1841 collection feature it as a quality to enliven thought and communication. In Spiritual Laws, Emerson bemoaned the lack of power and meaning in public discourse, a problem he attributed to an absence of abandonment. After explaining that attending to one's work and performing it as fully as possible is a means of unfolding oneself, Emerson surmised that this unfolding, especially when considered in areas involving public expression, affected the very ways in which one would be received and understood. By unfold, he suggests some sort of natural process of opening or ripening, as he says earlier in the essay. Unless we work in such a way as to unfold ourselves and communicate from within the process of that unfolding, we will have little to contribute to the communities we inhabit. Our public speaking, he complained, has not abandoned. That is, our modes of formal communication are too careful, confined to expectations, too conventional, bent to conform to the small offices in which we are folded up. In the essay, Emerson's admonishment yielded encouragement. If you wish to speak truly and newly and necessarily and meaningfully with those of your community, whether great or small, then, as he said, let out all the length of all the reins. Public expression becomes a means by which one can practice abandonment, frank and hearty expression of what force and meaning one contains, which means further that public discourse presents the possibility of actively communicating one's own unfolding, passing along that unfolding to others. Emerson warned against the common experience of fitting oneself to the customary details of that work or trade into which one had fallen, thereby becoming part of the machine one operates, the technology one wields, the discipline to which one's professing must conform. What happens then? Well, for one, the living being is lost, a dire consequence which suggests that we passively lose the better part of ourselves in merely performing work, trade, discipline-specific functions. Active abandonment, according to Emerson, redresses that state of loss. One has to lose what one has taken to be oneself in order to recover one's lost self, in order to return to or regain one's vitality. Emerson writes, until he can manage to communicate himself to others in his full stature and proportion, he does not yet find his vocation. Unfolding involves communication. Call out. Call yourself out. Communicate your living being and meaning to others as a means of broadening your understanding of your calling. Spiritual laws represents a different stage or phase of abandonment. Here, abandonment comes through expression, a communicating of your unfolding self to others who inhabit particular spheres with you. But your calling, Emerson tried to point out, is not to be confused with the narrow confines in which one customarily operates, the meanness and formality of that thing you do, he wrote. Meanness denotes the meager, the commonly accepted, and even the selfish. Formality denotes submission to circumscribed limits and exterior forms. Passively accepting the place determined by your position within a profession or occupation is but a fool's errand. The wise, he remonstrated, will actively convert that thing you do, your actions and endeavors, into the obedient spiracle of your character and aims. A spiracle is an aperture for breathing. The essay suggests to me that when our actions open to the larger world to which our fields and subfields belong, those things we do will be more readily and more truly understood to be part of life, living. When our public expression has abandonment, we connect with and invigorate the process of unfolding in ourselves and others. This expressive mode of abandonment does not require that scholars invent some wacky and reckless manner of presenting their ideas to other scholars, but rather that we breathe new life in existing forms of the paper, the lecture, the book, the report. Let us let out the reins in our speaking and writing, unfolding within the discipline and beyond. Circles, the other essay from the 1841 volume, lays out Emerson's principles for the role of literature in intellectual endeavors and makes a case for different ways of thinking. Literature, according to Circles, entails writings that by their nature occupy a point outside of our customary ways of perceiving the world. Such writings are poised to offer fresh perspective on the world and on our present modes of making sense of the world. In this essay, abandonment is associated with forgetting ourselves, with being surprised out of our propriety. That which we take for the self is based largely on the piecing together of the personal past, projecting a course into the future based on the trajectory of that past, and staying the course of proper or appropriate behavior more or less unquestioningly and presumably indefinitely. Abandonment involves being willing to imagine another direction, degree, or drift, as well as the ability, as he writes, in short, to draw a new circle. And here I will interject that, put most simply, I take transdisciplinarity to be the attempt to draw a new circle. These qualities of imagination and writing connect abandonment with literature and its potential uses, but Emerson suggested that the latter belongs to the former, that literary activity might best be considered a medium through which intellectual circles may be understood and, on occasion, revised or abandoned. Abandonment, Emerson proposed in Circles, is a fundamental property of life itself. He wrote, "The way of life is wonderful. It is by abandonment." Abandonment is natural. It is a vein through which life flows. a means by which change occurs, a product of and process through which natural forces and conditions carry on and unfold. The complexity of the way of life, how life lives, the method of life, including growth and death, composition and decomposition, entropy and entropy, informed and conducted in part by abandonment, requires or at least invites would-be thinkers to acknowledge and affirm so elemental an aspect in their intellectual efforts to understand life and its ways. Thinking, for Emerson, entailed letting go as much as or even more so than holding fast, abandoning one's circle as much as or more than maintaining it. Mainly because he reckoned that, given the state of things, most people would take care of the holding fast and maintaining. Hope for better ways of living depends upon the temporary suspension of the ties that bind us to one way of thinking or another. He wrote, "People wish to be settled. The only hope is if they will be unsettled." If I let circles function as Emerson suggested literature might, as a smiting slap to the back of my head, I can begin to get a glimpse of my own academic circle and its limits. Disciplines and disciplinarity are self-maintained circles with boundaries fixed, interiors explored in depth, exteriors largely left to the maintenance of others, allowing for occasional intersections with another circle that in some instances enriches both, an intersection also known as interdisciplinarity. Perhaps Emerson's essay on thinking can be understood as a transcendentalist prototype of transdisciplinary intellectual processes. His abandonment thinking encourages radical tangents that revise the nature of existing circles, identifying literature as a means of revision, presumably because it combines imagination, language, reflection, association, heightened and diverse modes of intellectual activity. Transcendental disciplinarity inflects circularity with onwardness, infusing life with thinking, thinking with life, and all by abandonment. Draw a new circle. The essay titled "The Poet," the keynote for his 1844 series of essays, appeals to every intellectual man, as he wrote, to develop a new energy by abandonment to the nature of things. I take this phase or aspect of abandonment to involve drawing on what Emerson described as a great public power, rather than on one's privacy of power as an individual, which again rhymes with recent characterizations of transdisciplinarity. The essay urges the intellectual, which refers to a larger entity than a particular smart or well-schooled person, something akin to what he calls man-thinking in his essay, The American Scholar, the intellectual activity of the species as a whole. He calls on this person to unlock at all risks his human doors, an opening up that permits the ethereal tides to roll and circulate through him. When that occurs, the person is truly transformed into a living being belonging to life, maybe even more fully alive by virtue of letting life circulate through her or him, rather than restricting, controlling, protecting against such flow. The unlocking and unblocking result in a newfound energy, which in turn brings with it new forms of power and authority. When the poet abandons herself or himself to the nature of things, quote, he is caught up into the life of the universe. His speech is thunder, his thought is law, and his words are universally intelligible as the plants and animals, end quote. Emerson singles out the poet here as something other than one who writes poetry and all the cultural associations that adorn such a person. The poet is a name for one who is no longer oneself, who has abandoned her or himself to nature through active use of the intellect. An intellectual who reckons that adequate communication requires one to speak somewhat wildly, as he wrote. To speak so is to connect the intellect with celestial life, a far wider application of mind than the customary instrumentality of intellect used as an organ, as he wrote. The poet affirms intellect inebriated by nectar, letting go the reins and trusting the divine animal who carries us through the world. Once we have abandoned our petty selves and our parceled out intellects, new passages are opened for us into nature, as he wrote. The mind is released to participate in the flow of life, the living flow that streams through the nature of things. And then, Emerson wrote, the metamorphosis is possible. Interpreted as a poetical calling forth rather than as a prosaic, literal set of instructions, the essay posits abandonment as an act of letting go, with an emphasis on nature as that to which one lets oneself go. The thinker releases him or herself from the ties that bind and the customs that constrain thinking, unbinding the intellect to reconnect with the nature of things, which is at once the nature of things of this earth, for example, plants and animals, and the nature of celestial life, an idea represented in the combinatory figure of the divine animal on which one is carried through the world, the animus, or animating principle in all living beings. Abandoning one's particular and peculiar self to the nature of things empowers one to speak in a way resonant with nature, thunderous, consonant with natural principles, and redolent with meaning, universally intelligible. Abandonment is the intellectual affirmation of something bigger, to which we always belong, through the negation of something smaller, that which we mistake for our natural mode of thinking and being. Transcending limits, including disciplinary boundaries, and letting oneself understanding be infused by, suffused to, refused with nature, the practitioner of abandonment risks confusion, but is reformed into a voice for the nature of things, speaking somewhat wildly and creating new forms of nature, life, world, through which courses the inseparable laminate flow of the animal celestial. Abandonment thus can be understood as a discipline, a way of study, a way of life, a way of connecting study to life and living. With its common connotations of leaving home, abandonment is, transcendentally and transdisciplinarily considered, also a way of going home. And to explain what I mean by this apparent paradox, I'll conclude by describing my current experiment in textual potamology. That's why I chuckle every time I read this, because my shorthand for it in this talk is teapot. So my current experiment in teapot, an investigation into the nature of one of the nation's strangest streams, the Los Angeles River. Although not completely covered over by human structures, the fate of many urban waterways, the LA River has been largely hidden from human awareness, abandoned as a river. Long before it was called river, even before it was called rio, this stream and its watershed attracted the attention of various life forms, including humans. Hokan-speaking peoples lived near the waters as long as 10,000 years ago, until they were absorbed into or displaced by the Tonga people around 1,300 to 1,400 years ago. The Spanish named the principal waters of the basin El Rio de Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles de la Porciúncula on August 2nd, 1769. North Porciúncula meaning little portion, in honor of the minute chapel in Italy where St. Francis of Assisi had been visited by divine revelations. Until the middle of the 19th century, it ran under the name Porciúncula. When it officially became the Los Angeles River is unclear. In the 2.5 centuries since it entered European consciousness, the 51-mile stream has undergone diversion of its flow, widespread clearing of the floodplain, the proliferation of surface paving in the surrounding area, and the eventual depletion of underground sources. This led to importing water to Los Angeles from sources far away, which contributed to a sense that the existing river was no longer much of a river. as its age-old practice of periodic flooding began to have an increasingly catastrophic effect on the burgeoning population of the city, the massive flood control projects of the 20th century made it seem even less like a river, furthering its neglect by residents of and visitors to the most populous county in the United States. Recently, however, diverse groups of people, including artists, activists, scientists, architects, local officials, have set about re-rivering Los Angeles. In 2010, the Environmental Protection Agency declared the river's waters officially navigable, overturning prior declarations to the contrary by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and other governmental entities, thereby granting the river and its tributaries protection under the Clean Water Act. This past summer, Governor Jerry Brown signed SB 1201, granting increased public access to the waterway and reclassifying it. What had become a flood control channel was now once again to be considered a river. In many ways, the LA River presents a case study of the life, death, and potential resurrection of urban streams in the U.S. As a textual potamologist, I am combining fieldwork on the river with other research about Los Angeles as a means of daylighting the river. Daylighting most commonly refers to the process of redirecting the channel of a stream that has been covered or obstructed by human structures, a physical return to open air. Seeing the term as having figural potential, I have adopted it for an exploration of literature and the cultural history of the river in an effort to imagine new ways of understanding its nature. Textual potamology presents the possibility of bringing to light not only the river, but our thought processes, our social practices, and cultural biases regarding urban waterways. My study consists of three main parts. In the first section, I'm weaving together a study of fictional representations of the river with fieldwork, photographs like these and my own descriptive writing, on the lower portion of the river, from its mouth in Long Beach to its confluence with Rio Hondo. While it is a commonplace that fiction can enrich history through its manipulation of narrative, image, setting, character, etc., one of fiction's chief assets is its facility for revealing paradoxes in our ways of thinking about nature. Novels such as City of Angels by Rupert Hughes and films such as Roman Polanski's Chinatown disrupt customary thought processes by presenting a river that does not conform to standard definitions of river, a phenomenon that paradoxically both is and is not a river. By considering fictional treatments of the conceptual end of the river, that is, when it ceases to be considered a real river, and connecting that study with my own representations of the physical end of the river, where it enters the ocean, I am trying to open up questions of the nature of this strange urban waterway. The middle portion of the river, centered on the confluence with the Arroyo Seco and encompassing the traditional site of the city's founding, is the focus of the second section. Field research on this stretch of the river is to be connected with the study of non-fictional literature, histories, guidebooks, maps, and other descriptive writing, including recent work by Jennifer Price. Her essay, 13 Ways of Seeing Nature in LA, with its concern for the genre of nature writing, uses literature to encourage a general rethinking of the concept of nature. From the earliest description of the river, Father Crespi's 18th century account of the Spanish discovery of Los Angeles, to Price's nature writing, non-fictional writing has brought together place and stories and ideas in a momentous swirl. This portion of the study investigates the extent to which such texts function as a conceptual mapping that helps us find hidden or lost nature. In the final section, I consider the upper portion of the river. And we've been moving upriver in these pictures, by the way. I think I might finish before we get to the headwaters, but there you have it. In the final section, I consider the upper portion of the river from its headwaters to the Glendale Bend. This part of the study connects the river's origins with an investigation of poetry. While fictional representations of the LA River can reveal paradoxes, and non-fictional works can guide readers to the heart of the river. Poetic versions present the possibility of reimagining a kind of at-homeness in the river's basin. Certain poetic representations of the LA River Basin make an attempt to ground our ideas, to lead words back home and connect language with locale, community with habitat, humans with watershed. In a poem called The Concrete River, the title both a basic descriptor of streams in the LA Basin and an oxymoron, Luis J. Rodriguez explores fundamental barrio displacements, describing the desperation and drug use of two Chicano youths. The poem proposes that home is a place from which we are currently estranged, appealing to readers to reimagine ways of dwelling in the world. Gary Snyder, in a poem that begins with an owl poem, affirms a multifaceted waterway-oriented home in Night Song of the Los Angeles Basin, offering the poem as a means of taking readers to the place, quote, where the river debouches, the place of the moment of trembling and gathering and giving, end quote. Each river is a living emblem of complexity. Textual Potamology acknowledges this complexity that tangles between the past and the present, between culture and nature, between sciences and philosophies, faith and doubt, working through texts and contexts to get down to the river. The textual potamologist attempts to transcend traditional disciplinary structure, abandoning the cubicle, the lab, the library, the study, walking out of such chambers into the confusion of the day, to hear the owl, clear as a bell, calling us out, calling us forth, calling us home to a nature behind the comma. What do you want me to do?
Answer questions.
Oh, okay.
Answer questions.
All right.
Stay up.
Very good.
That's how we do it. No. Stay.
Okay, I'm gonna get some
You
water.
can sit down.
I'll stand wherever you want me to. Any kind of potamologist needs reserve water. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't need to have the first question, but I have a great question. It's been sitting with me since you began. I thought this was wonderful. And some of the images that you evoked when you were presenting, and on the other side, the images that were coming on the screen. Sometimes they sort of sat one on the other, and sometimes they set up point of reference. And I was struck by the fact that when you use the word abandonment, I sort of was trying to write down the ways in which that word was being employed, and the figures of speech we were using. And I put down as many as I could put down, and maybe this is not an exhaustive list. So the first one I said was abandon, or abandonment as an action. And second I said a state of being. A third was a found object. The fourth was a quality. A fifth I thought was a position of opposition. A sixth I felt was a hermeneutic aperture, almost an armature to look at things. And I could go on, I'm sure, if I heard your talk again. And it seems to me that it is but natural to actually have a point of abandonment, to be able to abandon. But on the other hand, the way Emerson and you sort of beseeched that please abandon, it almost seems as if it's not really easy to abandon human beings. So I don't know if I'm asking you a question or making a statement. Is it easy to abandon for humans?
No. No, it's not easy. I think it's really hard. It's almost impossible. How easy is it to do transdisciplinary studies? It's not meant to be easy, or it's not designed to be easy, the way things are set up now. We're not structured, we haven't enculturated ourselves to be people who can abandon things easily. And we fact, we've given abandonment usually a negative connotation. Someone who doesn't care about others or walks out on one's responsibilities or something like that. And it seems to me what Emerson is asking is an abandonment of structures that no longer work or don't have to be understood as the actual truth, the way of living or something like that, in order to imagine what other possibilities there might be. But that's really hard.
So sort of extending this to sort of Textual terminology, you said there was a signifier and a signifier. There was an abandoner and there was an abandoned. Is anything more important? Are they both equally significant? Because I think something that you left behind is as important as something that you find.
Like home.
It's almost like abstraction. Where you almost understand abstraction better by the negative of what abstraction is not versus what abstraction really is.
Yeah, and so in that case, it would seem like that pursuing where the signifier might take you is necessary for a better understanding of the signifier. Basically, Emerson, I think there might be some truth in that, in different ways of thinking about the objects with which we find ourselves, and we need to orient ourselves to the world. That by trying to rethink the ways in which we construe those objects, we make it possible to then reconstrue the ground in which those objects are. Yeah.
I guess I'd like to push on that a little bit more. I want to thank you for the flows of your talk very much. I enjoyed the rhythms of the reading and how you're presenting it. And again, the background of your words against the way the pictures moved behind. But I was struck again, you said abandonment is hard, and yet there are so many photographs of easy abandonment, right? Of the shoes and the cell phone and so many market carts. And so, there is abandonment of a different kind.
Yes.
I mean, and I was glad when at the end you talked about the abandonment of the river and the sort of refinding of the river. But those objects didn't come in that discussion. So, building on the previous question, I'm curious how you talk about that kind of abandonment and those sorts of objects, because that seems altogether too easy.
Yeah. That's a great question. And so there are different levels or degrees of abandonment. And I think in one point I talked about the idea of having to abandon abandonment. So that, Emerson is saying that we've already abandoned many good things or good ways of understanding the world or what have you. And part of what we need to be able to abandon is that habit of abandonment that causes us to just throw stuff away or conspicuous consumption of a sort or something like that. I don't know. I haven't really pursued this farther. But I think that in working out a full-scale philosophy of abandonment, which I haven't done yet, that would have to be an important part of it. And the river works well with that. The river keeps reminding me that there are these other things, these other ways of seeing abandonment that one has to take seriously. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is really fascinating thought-provoking. Thank you very much. I'm going to season a different word that for me was the one that I think was troubling in some ways and just wanted to get, I don't know if it's going to come out as a reflection or if you can respond to or a question, but we'll see. And the word is nature. Partly because some thoughts. One is that, in talking about I don't know a whole lot about transcendentalists, but I sort of took that as a sort of, step outside of the received ways of encountering nature and return to the direct, unmediated call of the owl and sort of thing. And I think it was troubling for me because it was also helpful for me because I was thinking about in some of these tensions around the perils of transdisciplinarity. about the present day, tensions around nature and transdisciplinarity. How can we sort of translate some of these ideas about abandonment and the kind of insights towards transdisciplinarity were very much, in some ways, a product of that time, taken to today?
How to translate that? I don't know. That's what I think each of us has to try to figure out to do in our own ways. The problem with nature there, I don't think it's necessarily a nature to go back to. For one. I think it's not just, it doesn't believe in some kind of primordial understanding to which we can return. It takes, for me, Emersonian thought, and certainly some of the later philosophers, including the Transdisciplinarians, take nature as something that includes our thinking about it. So that we're not necessarily going back, we're maybe going forward, but maybe some of those previous historical ideas about nature might be useful to us. But the ways in which we currently construe nature aren't the only way to construe nature. And we can believe that it's a social construct, or we can believe that it's fundamentally real, and that's the way it's often been fought over in, say, eco-criticism. And there will be a camp of people who say, it's all social construction. We can't, and this happens more in British eco-criticism, I think, than American. In fact, the British responding to American eco-criticism, which has often done that kind of thing you're talking about, thinking about a primordial nature to which we can turn, it's all about wilderness, and they use Thoreau as a kind of poster boy for that stuff. But I think that there's that primordial way there's that nature, it's all real, it's all this bottom line nature, and there's this, it's all socially constructed, and that's what we have to worry about. And that itself speaks to the need for transdisciplinarity that doesn't do just one of those. Either one of those to me is similar to science or literature that Thoreau talks about needing to transcend. And he says go behind rather than go beyond, so there are even different ways of understanding transcending, I guess. One of the things that resonates with me about that as well, there's a beginning to an essay by Peril called Milwaukee. And it's got this really, it's provocative. And one thing I should say, first of all, is that all of this, for me, is based upon an idea that I stole from Emerson about provoking rather than instructing. I can't give you transdisciplinarity or do transdisciplinarity for you. I can try to figure out ways or questions that one might ask that might prompt better ways of thinking than I'm capable of doing, basically. So I can provoke. And Walking is this essay that begins with one of the most excellent provocations of all time. And Thoreau begins with the first line saying, I wish to speak a word for nature, which is kind of haughty, arrogant to say I'm going to speak a word for nature. But he goes on to explain in this first paragraph that school boards and churches and basically any literate person, they'll be willing to speak words for culture, for society, for the world that we have socially constructed. But not many people are willing to speak this word for whatever that is, this thing called nature. So the question they began with, which is what is nature really, is a central question and not easily answered and not clearly definable. It needs to keep an open definition. Maybe maintaining open definitions, maintaining the kind of, what kind of problem is it? The wicked problem. And taking nature as the wickedest of problems would be important to transdisciplinary. That's the kind of stuff I'm getting out of at least Nicolescu and that school of transdisciplinary, which is far, I think, from what some other takes on it are, but it comes from that theoretical criticism.
So two things, picking up maybe on Ryan's question a little bit. So I think that the reading of Emerson as transdisciplinary, as going across boundaries rather than as transcending, that is the idea that, that these disciplines don't speak to each other in a sense was not so prevalent at that point. And in fact, if we take the point of Emerson and Thoreau as being about crossing beyond limits, one could perhaps even imagine that for them, a move to disciplinary could also be extravagant in the right context, or transcendent in the right context. So I wonder if you just would speak to that.
I don't know what to say to that. I think it's entirely possible. I mean, but I guess what I'm thinking about now is seeing the extent to which those understandings are translatable to a different moment and what can be learned from it. So back then, yeah, that it could have led to that. And it's interesting to think about Thoreau not accepting his invitation to join the Academy of Sciences at the time, right? And then also the sciences or literature line, kind of not really throwaway line, but something you can pass over pretty quickly and we come in time for rivers. That there is a word over the ways in which one set of ways of construing the world operates and what that might be keeping us from seeing. But the one, I think the extravagance is absolutely beautiful. This is a word that Thoreau plays with quite a bit at the end of Walden, a very key moment. And he uses it in a way to explain his writing as a rule. It's an extravagant. He uses the word a couple times. He italicizes it. He writes with different kinds of hyphens and things like that. And he calls attention to its roots, which are beyond and a wandering, extravagance. And I wish to speak somewhere beyond bounds and things like that. And it's not, I guess it's the case that he's not speaking from somewhere beyond yet. I wish I could. I wish I could be transdisciplinarian. Maybe I'm on the way to it, but I'm not there yet. So here's what I'll try to do, and I'll see if in doing that I can get somewhere else, somewhere further.
I mean, the way just to add historically, I guess maybe one way to think about it is that Thoreau and Emerson are writing at a moment when the disciplines are just beginning to separate and occupy. So there is an Academy of Sciences example.
Yes.
We're now thinking at a moment when they have, maybe when they're breaking down. I mean, maybe we're seeing the end of this kind of historical trajectory that began precisely as you're.
And they're complaining about it at times. I mean, Emerson will talk about how science isn't thinking in terms of relation.
Right.
It's not poetical.
Right.
So, but it is starting at that time. Yes.
So this is from the perspective of when I'm an architect. We obviously have to try and abandon things sometimes to think creatively. There's no doubt about it. But we also sometimes need to use history and precedent and context to find things. And it almost seems to me like those are not easily made compatible, and they represent maybe two, I'm not sure if they're two disciplines, but so how would a Thoreau or an Emerson reconcile those, or wouldn't they?
Yeah, I don't know, it would have to be reconciliation. One thing would be, I think, that as an architect, you become more willing to collaborate with others so that you still do what you're disciplinarily good at. And you work with others who are disciplinarily good at other things, and then that moves towards something transdisciplinary. And that, as far as I can understand the way transdisciplinarity works, it's not only is the case that you do your architect thing, but you do your architect thing in conjunction with others, and that leads to a different kind of thing that you do than just what was your architecture from before. So collaboration is one way. But I think it's also the case, as I said about Thoreau's book, so there's a transdisciplinary moment, if you accept it, when he goes outside from doing his work in literature, and he hears the owl, and it shakes him loose from the ways that he had been thinking about something. But then he goes back inside, and he does his architecture, or he does his writing. But you got to give yourself the possibility of being opened up to these different ways of seeing things as well.
And as a natural scientist, I study sort of evolutionary adaptation in species. And in the natural world, abandonment is often a very progressive concept and progressive idea from an evolutionary perspective.
Yes.
In your pictures, the migratory waterfall, migration as a way of abandoning to something better. Whereas humans, we tend to think of it as you meant it as negative. And in terms of the perils perils and promise of transdisciplinarity, one of the things is we tend to think of these as gains versus losses. And several metaphors kind of, from my own work and readings that came to mind from the natural sciences and evolution, things, for example, like migratory, birds, but also things like the loss of traits through, like when organisms live underground, they lose their eyes. They lose traits that had once been adapted. And we think of this, you can see it in human society, it's very hard to lose those things.
Right.
And even more recently, something that we think of, like, for example, species, is a concept that we look at as a progressive thing. We think, oh, loss of species is a bad thing. And in fact, molecular biology now is showing that throughout all the time, species have basically despeciated as an adaptive process as things change. Many species we see today were actually created out of species basically abandoning species and coming back together. And so there's a lot of, I think, the parallels between what you were talking about in terms of that follow from the natural world.
Thanks, I mean, I really like to think more about that, that's perfect, because it gives me a new way of understanding a phrase like the way of life is wonderful defined. It's like the way of life is
Yeah,
wonderful
we think of
defined.
we always think of adaptation as a moving forward, but sometimes the adaptive process is actually reformulating or kind of going backwards.
Yeah, and I get the sense in reading Emerson that his idea of evolution is not, it's not the same kind of progress that we usually assume. It is more of a change and a kind of onwardness of
You
the
know,
moving.
the fossil record is full of organisms that specialize themselves for extinction.
Yeah.
So can we try to keep on target and take a short break? At this point, we'll have more opportunity to continue to talk.